Today we continue the series on the Bible creation account, and in this particular section we've been looking at the various false narratives that are out there dealing with how mankind came into the earth and the origins of life in the earth as well. And so we've looked at previously the false narrative of the young earth creation account. In today's teaching and the one going forward after this, most probably, we're going to have a look at the theory of evolution, because obviously that is the predominant theory in the earth with regards to how mankind came about and also the origins of life in the earth. And so we're going to look at, there are a lot of scientific arguments that actually do refute the theory of evolution. And we're going to look at three of those arguments in showing that the theory of evolution is actually, it's a false theory. It doesn't actually pan out when it's examined closely. As I say, there are very many more arguments against it, but we're just going to look at three of them. We'll look at two particular arguments today. We're going to look at the mathematical argument against it, and we're also going to look at the fossil record argument against the theory of evolution. But before we get into refuting the theory of evolution, we need to understand the difference between there are two different types of evolution. And today's teaching and the next one is going to be relatively looking at a lot of scientific comments and scientific discussion, because that's really where this theory does come from. It's a natural theory produced by natural thinking mankind, and so we're having to look at arguments against it from a natural point of view as well. And so there are these two different types of evolution that is recognized in the earth today. One is called microevolution and the other one is called macroevolution. Now, microevolution is a legitimate scientific, it's not a theory. Microevolution is in fact proven to be true. And there's a lot of credible scientific evidence, there's ample scientific evidence that is out there that proves such a thing as microevolution. It is macroevolution that is the disputed scientific argument, which we will look at as we get into the series. But with regards to microevolution, as I say, it is very clear in scientific observation that this, it's not a theory, this is in actual fact, a scientific fact. There is such a thing as microevolution. So what is microevolution? It is a scientific term that is used to explain how organisms are able to self-adjust to changes in their environmental surroundings. And so we see that because now God is the one who instituted that, for God is the creator of all species. So what God did when he created the species is that he pre-programmed their DNA to be able to make adjustments to their physiology in order to cope with any consistent change to the environment. And so a simple explanation of microevolution, something that we can all kind of recognize and understand, is when a person relocates from a cold environment, or a warm environment, let's go that route, from a warm environment to a cold environment. So they're normally living in the tropics, now they move into living in a northern or southern hemisphere country where it's a lot colder. What happens is when they arrive there, and I'm talking about moving there on a semi-permanent basis, when they arrive there, what they find is because their bodies have acclimatized to a warm environment and they're now exposed to the colder environment, they have to walk around with a jersey on, whereas their colleagues who are living currently and have been living in the colder environment all the time can walk around with short sleeve shirts. So why is the difference taking place? It's because their bodies, the person who's relocated to the colder environment, has not yet adjusted physiology-wise to its cold surroundings. but what happens over a period of time is their bodies do then begin to adjust and acclimatize to the colder environment. And so it takes time, but it doesn't take a lot of time for their bodies to eventually acclimatize, that they too can start walking around in a short sleeve shirt in that environment. It takes a few months, but initially their bodies cannot cope with the cold environment that the other humans walking around with in the same environment can cope with. And the reason is purely because there hasn't been that physiological adjustment being made in their bodies. Their bodies have not acclimatized to the new environment. Over time, their bodies do make the adjustment, and thus they can start walking around in short sleeve shirts as well. So what God has done is within each one of his species, he's inbuilt into that species a certain tolerance level whereby the physiology of that organism is able to make adjustments, self-adjustments to itself in order to be able to acclimatize to its new environment that it gets exposed to. But it's very limited in its adjustments that it can make. And so God has placed a limit on what the organism can adjust itself to in order to acclimatize itself to changes in its environment. Think about horses, for argument's sake. In the winter, they produce a shaggy fur coat to accommodate with the cold that they go through. In the summer, they shed that coat, and they have then a shortened fur that is or hair that is on their bodies. And so that's the kind of tolerance that God has placed into each one of his creations in order to be able to cope with changes in the environment that cause their bodies do need to be able to change in order to be able to cope. So I trust you understand the concept about microevolution. It is scientifically proven. We all understand it. It does work. That's what God has done in his creation. He's pre-programmed his creation to be able to do that. And now that brings us across to the second category of evolution, which is called macroevolution. This theory is that one species can ultimately evolve into another species that never existed before. And so what natural scientists do is they observe the process of microevolution, and then they foolishly try to extrapolate that concept to accommodate their theory of macroevolution. The reasoning is that an organism can change over time to acclimatize to a changed environment. If the organism can over time acclimatize itself to a changed environment, that's microevolution, then the argument is then surely over an extended period of time the same organism can evolve into another species entirely. That's their thinking. They just go through that natural thinking process because, as I say, science can prove, and we all know to be true, microevolution exists. So they say, all right, given it enough time, surely microevolution can keep on evolving, keep on changing until it produces a brand new species that didn't exist before. And that's their logic. So why do they want to think like that? Well, they want to think like that because they have to be able to explain the different species that have appeared in the earth. Because don't forget, we've done the history of the Earth's timeline, and we've seen that how God does it is that in an age he creates an era of species to live in that age. At the end of the age he causes a mass extinction event to take place, wiping out that era of species. The new age comes and God creates a new era of species for the new age. Now there's strong scientific evidence showing that happening. They can see the extinction event occurring, all of those species being destroyed or disappearing, and they see the new species coming into the earth. So natural man has got to explain that. Now they cannot go the route of looking at a creator to explain that because they deny that God exists. So they have to come up with a natural explanation of, well, how does the new species come? They don't. The mass extinction event explains how the old species disappeared, and that we know to be the truth. However, where did the new species come from? So now they've got to try and explain the new species. So they come up with this natural explanation that microevolution, given sufficient time, can evolve into macroevolution. In other words, one species can evolve into becoming a completely different species entirely over an extended period of time. So that's the reason they come up with the explanation, and that's their logic of applying the theory of it's not the theory, the scientific truth of microevolution to come up with the theory of macroevolution. And so just to bring us to the point, and that is that macroevolution is just that. It is the theory. Microevolution is not a theory, it's a known scientific fact. And as I say, biblical scholars acknowledge it. We acknowledge it because we know it to be true. But macroevolution is a theory. And a theory is just that. It's not fact, it's theory. And we do need to understand that particular concept. But and that theory was put in place by a chap by the name of Darwin. We all know about Charles Darwin. He's the one who put into the earth this theory of the evolution of species, so to speak. And so the theory states in essence states that it's a process by which organisms can change over time as a result of changes to heritable physical and behavioral traits. This theory was first formulated in Darwin's book on Origins of Species in 1859. And so Darwinism, as the theory of evolution is commonly known, maintains that all living things are descendants of a common ancestor that have been modified by unguided natural processes over hundreds of millions of years. And so one of the best examples that scientists use to try to prove this theory is by trying to show how a raccoon type animal that existed 50 million years ago evolved into becoming the humpback whale that we see in the oceans of the earth today. And so the animal they look at, it was the size of a raccoon. It looked pretty much like a raccoon. They call it an Idahosaurus rhodoli. And they say that this particular animal underwent several transformational processes over the 50 million year period, and eventually it became the humpback whale. And so if you look at the diagrams in books on evolution, you can see how they try and show that this raccoon evolved into another species, which evolved into another species, and over the 50 million years eventually has turned out into the humpback whale that we see in the earth today. Now the reason they try to link the two is because both have a similar ear bone in their physiology. And so they say, okay, because they both got the same similar ear bone, well then that raccoon had to become the humpback whale over the 50 million years. And that's how they try and explain the theory of evolution. But the scriptural comment comes to mind that proclaiming to be wise they became fools is brought to mind when you look at it as how they can possibly come up with this idea that that little raccoon could become the humpback whale over 50 million years purely by chance, random selection, and evolving over this period of time. But because this theory denies a creator, this theory is enthusiastically embraced by all unbelievers, and so this theory has been adopted throughout the earth and is taught in all the schools, major schools in the earth, well, all the schools by and large, the universities, And so it's accepted around the world as being the explanation as to the origins of life in the earth. And so there is this, obviously, there is now this complete controversy that exists between Darwinism and creationism. Creationism looking at God as the creator, Darwinism looking at evolution as the reason to explain all of these different species that are in the earth today. And so, as I say, there are numerous, many scientific arguments that completely refute Darwinism. We're only going to look at 3 of those scientific arguments in this series, and we're going to look at 2 of them today. The first argument that completely refutes Darwinism or the theory of evolution is the mathematical argument that is put forward, because it's argued that evolution is both mathematically and logically, should I say, an impossibility. It just cannot happen. And there are many world-renowned scientists, non-Christian scientists, today that have done the calculations and have all come to the same conclusion, and that is that evolution by mutation and natural selection is both mathematically and logically indefensible. It just doesn't, the math doesn't work out, and numbers don't lie. But, and as I say, many scientists, non-believing, non-Christian scientists, mathematicians, look at Darwinism, they look at the theory of evolution, they do the calculations, they say, guys, you must be absolutely nuts to believe that this can be the truth, because it just cannot be the truth. It's indefensible, they say, mathematically and logically speaking. And so I'm going to summarize one of the very many scientific articles that have been written on this issue that address this point. Scientists have taken the example of a very simple organism composed of only 200 molecular parts. And so it should be noted that even a one-celled plant or animal has many millions of molecular parts to it. So, you know, we're looking at a 200-part molecular organism, but I mean, even that is proven to be completely impossible for evolution to have formed, but we'll go through it. But the point that I just want to make is that a one-celled plant or one-celled animal, living organism in the earth, has millions of molecular parts to it. But we're looking at just a 200 molecular part organism. And the problem of trying to derive that organism by the process of evolution, that is, this process of random mutation that just occurs by natural selection over a period of time. And so the system presumably must have started with only one part, obviously, because that's what theory of evolution is that everything started with just one cell, and we have this whole planet of living organisms today from that one cell. Only started with one part and then gradually built itself up over many generations into its 200-part organization. So that's the example they use. The developing organism at each successive stage must itself be integrated and functioning in its environment in order to survive until the next stage. So let's see the example they give. Each successive stage, of course, becomes statistically less likely than the preceding one, since it is far easier for a complex system to break down than to build itself up. In other words, a 4-component integrated system can more easily mutate, that is, suddenly somehow change into a 3-component system or even a 4-component non-functioning system, rather than mutating into a 5-component integrating system. And so the way it works is that you've got this one component in the system. We're trying to get to 200 parts, 200 components. It goes to a 2-component, goes to a 3, goes to a 4, 5, and builds itself up slowly over time to this 200 component system. But each stage, so once it gets to it has to function as a one component system, it then has to function as a two component system, it has to function as a three component system, and so all of these various stages have to be functional components. They can't just be something that doesn't work anymore. It all has to continue working. And so they say, from that point of view, that each stage becomes statistically more and more impossible to actually take place. They say that if at each step in the chain the system mutates downwards, in other words, it was a four component system, instead of progressing to five, it then mutates down to a three component system, then it is either destroyed altogether or moves backwards in an evolutionary sense. Therefore, the successful production of a 200 component functioning organism requires at least 200 successful such mutations. So it's got to be able to progress 200 times, each mutation improving on the other one by one component to build up to this 200 component system. Each of which is highly unlikely. And so in their calculations, they assumed that each mutational step, that there would be an equally as much chance of it succeeding or not succeeding, so good or bad. Thus, the probability of success of each mutation is assumed to be 1 out of 2 or 1/2. But normally you would look at 1 out of 1,000 or even a couple of thousand. But they're trying to be kind in their calculations. So they're saying the chance of the mutation succeeding, they say, all right, there's a half a chance it will, half a chance it won't. 1 out of 2, it will succeed. So they've used that as the premise for the calculation. And so they say that elementary statistical theory shows that the probability of 200 successive mutations being successful, that is, the chance that any kind of a 200 component integrated functioning organism could be developed by mutation and natural selection just once. And they're talking about just one organism. And they're not talking about the millions of organisms that are out in the earth today. They're looking at just one. And they're saying the chances that one 200 component system being produced anywhere in the world in all the assumed expanse of geological time. Now they used a time frame of 10 billion years. Now scientists tell us that the earth is only 4.5 billion years old. And so the organisms have only had 4.5 billion years in order to form all of the species that are on the earth today. But what the mathematicians did is they said, okay, we're going to work over a 10 billion year period, and we're going to look at a one-part component system forming, within a 10 billion year period, a 200-part component system. One only, anywhere in the world, over 10 billion years. So they're not looking at everything else, they just want to get the 200 component system. And they want to now apply the theory of evolution of random chance selection by natural selection taking place. That's the theory. And how we're going to get to this 200. They apply that theory to get this component system to build itself up out of one organism. And so the mathematical calculation works out to this. The answer is that it is less than one chance out of 1 billion trillion that it will actually take place. So in order to build up from one component to a 200 component system over 10 billion years using the theory of evolution, the chance of it actually happening, just that one unit happening, is one chance in 1 billion trillion. And so there is no credible science that argues against that mathematical formula that has been applied. And it's not only, that's just one scientific article that we've looked at. There are many reputable mathematicians, scientists in the earth today that have done the calculations of Darwinism, and they said, guys, it is a mathematical impossibility. It is an illogical, it's a logical impossibility. It cannot happen that you can go from a one-celled organism to even a 200-celled organism functioning, and it just can't happen, because even over 10 billion years, the chance of that being made is going to be a billion trillion, one chance in a billion trillion. Now think about all of the billions of organisms that are on the earth today. And so mathematically and logically speaking, statistically speaking, Darwinism fails on every level. It just doesn't stand up to scrutiny. And so there are a lot of non-believing scientists who looked at Darwinism, mathematicians, example, and have said, we've got to come up with another theory, because that theory is proven to be completely false. So that's the one argument that kind of just refutes the theory of evolution. The second argument, which we'll look at today, is the scientific argument against the theory of evolution is the lack of fossil records in the earth today. Because the problem with successful random chance mutations is that for every single successful mutation, there has to be a vast number of unsuccessful mutations discarded through natural selection. So the argument, the way that the theory works, theory of evolution, is that it's only by chance and natural selection that one organism progresses to the next level. But in the process of one organism progressing to the next level, there are millions of similar organisms that have failed, and so they just then die off. And so if the theory is proven to be true, then for each successful organism there has to be millions of unsuccessful organisms that have died, and their fossil records should be in the earth today in order for scientists to view them. But the problem that scientists come up with is there are only fully formed species in the fossil records. There are no discarded half-formed species or deformed species. And there should be billions of them out there in relation to the successful ones that are being found in the earth. And so scientists have a huge problem with that, because the fossil record doesn't account for what should be there, because that's what the theory tells us. The theory tells us that for every successful mutation there has to be millions of unsuccessful mutations, which means they get discarded and they also are lying in the fossil record. They're not there. The reason they're not there is because the theory is a fictitious, it's a false theory. As we said, it's just a theory, it's not scientific fact. And so they really are, it's one of the arguments that the scientists like to ignore, because they have to ignore it, because it glaringly it shows their theory to be false. In fact, Charles Darwin himself is the one that raised the problem with his theory. The scientist, the comment says, the fossil record has long been recognized as a problem for evolutionary theory. In The Origins of Species, this is Darwin himself, Darwin explained that his theory led him to believe that the number of intermediate varieties, so these are the varieties that just didn't pass, they didn't carry on up the chain, so to speak, and up the evolutionary ladder because they just failed. The number of intermediate varieties which have formerly existed on Earth must be truly enormous. It's his own words. However, he understood that the fossil record did not document these intermediate forms of life. Asking, why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links. Darwin's answer showed the tenuous nature of the evidence backing his ideas. Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain. And this, now this is his own word, perhaps, is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory. And so even Darwin recognized that the lack of fossil records to support his theory brought its validity into question, because there's no records there to support the theory. And so without any evidence to support the theory remains a theory. And all evidence points to the theory being completely flawed. It just is erroneous and should not even be considered. And so we just looked at two arguments today against the theory of evolution, which is the one is the mathematical and statistical argument against it. Mathematically and statistically, it is an impossibility for the theory of evolution to have happened. And then the fact is that there is just no fossil records to point to all of these millions, which Darwin himself acknowledged should be there, of, well, not millions, it would eventually translate into billions, of the failed or intermediary species that just didn't pan out. So, of the one species that managed to jump to the next level, there should have been millions that just along the way, through natural selection, their evolution didn't work out, and so they just died off. But they're not there. And the reason they're not there is because the theory is just that. It's a theory, it's a fictitious theory, but the world has embraced it, very sadly. However, more and more scientists, credible scientists, I'm talking about Christians, I'm talking about non-believing scientists, have begun to say, guys, we need to come up with another theory, because Darwinism is in fact wrong. And we're going to end the teaching on that.